pine woods pressed in with a suffocating stillness that felt like a weight on Bristol McGrath's spirit. The darkness under the trees seemed fixed and watchful, like the old superstitions people whispered about this forgotten backcountry. Memories from childhood, grim tales of shadowy shapes moving through moonlit glades, rose unbidden. McGrath, who had been born among these pines and then spent 16 wandering years abroad, cursed the primitive dread that still clung to him and lengthened his stride along the serpentine trail that twisted between towering trunks. He finally understood why no one from the river village would drive him out to the Ballville estate. The road was a wreck of stumps and sapling growth, impossible for a cart. He rounded a sharp bend and froze. The silence shattered with a sound that raised the hairs on his hands, a human groan, raw and tortured. Instinct dissolved hesitation. McGrath flowed forward around the curve with the noiseless, supple motion of a hunting cat. A snub-nosed blue revolver seemed to appear in his right fist of its own accord. In his left, within his pocket, his fingers clenched a crumpled slip of paper, the reason he had come signed by the man he despised most, and bearing the name of a woman he had believed dead for 3 years. What he found in the trail was worse than anything he had expected. A man lay spread eagle, wrists and ankles lashed to 4 pegs hammered deep into the hard ground. A hook-nosed, black-bearded, dark-skinned man McGrath recognized immediately. Ahmed, he breathed, Ballville's Arab servant. But it wasn't the ropes that glazed the man's eyes. Knives had cut him with expert cruelty. The mutilations spoke of someone who had learned torture like an art. McGrath, who had seen a half-flayed man pegged as a warning on a jungle path long ago, felt his mind lurch back to a different continent and a different nightmare. He cut the cords and tried to make the man more comfortable. It was all he could do. A moment of clarity ignited in the fever-glossed eyes. Ahmed's lips writhed. McGrath glimpsed the stump of a severed tongue. The man's fingers clawed in the dust, shaking but purposeful. McGrath bent low and watched crooked grooves appear beneath those trembling nails. In Arabic characters, the dying servant scratched out a message: Richard Ballville, then danger, and a pointing gesture up the trail. Then another name, Constance. The hand tried one last time, John De Albor, and then clenched and went limp. Ahmed ibn Suleiman was beyond pain, beyond vengeance. McGrath rose into a silence that somehow felt more menacing than any noise. He knew unseen eyes were on him. The boundary had been drawn. He could turn back to the distant village unmolested, or he could go on and be struck down before he realized from where the blow came. He turned, as if retreating, walked back to the last bend, and then stopped. He took the paper from his pocket and read again the scrawled plea that had dragged him halfway across the continent. Bristol, if you still love Constance Brand, for God's sake, forget your hate and come to Ballville Manor as quickly as the devil can drive you. Richard Ballville. That single name had detonated inside him when the telegram found him out west, where he had lived since returning from Africa. Constance Brand, the woman he had loved, the woman believed drowned. That name had set him racing by train and plane toward the pines of his childhood, as if hell itself drove him. He left the main trail and angled west through the trees with the soft tread of someone raised under these shadows. About 300 yards off, he found what he wanted, an almost forgotten path that paralleled the road, more a scar through saplings than a trail. He was sure it would bring him to the rear of the great house, and he doubted the hidden watchers were guarding it. How could they guess he remembered? He moved south along the faint track, ears straining. Vision meant little in these woods. sound would save him. The land opened under younger pines, where fields had once reached almost to Ballville Manor's lawns. Half a century of neglect had let the forest take it back. The house loomed soon after, a hulking bulk beyond the thinning trees. A scream ripped the stillness human, raw, and close enough to send him into a reckless sprint. He burst onto the weed-choked grounds. The barns and former slave quarters sagged into ruin behind the mansion. Even the big house seemed to teeter, a rotting giant gnawed by rats and time. He slid to a side window where horrible sounds seeped out, the kind that don't belong in daylight. He steadied himself and looked in. A vast, dust-filmed chamber spread before him, a ballroom once, perhaps. Cobwebs hung from the high ceiling. Dark oak paneling showed stains and age. In the fireplace, a tight little blaze heated slender iron rods to a white glare. But McGrath's eyes went first to the figure suspended from a rough crosspiece, bolted to a beam, a naked to the waist man, hanging by the wrists, toes barely brushing the floor, so that every moment of relief required a stretch that only shifted agony. The cords cut into his wrists. His hands were swollen and black. His body and limbs were seared in hideous patterns. On his breast, a burned symbol made McGrath's spine go cold. He had seen that mark once in a black jungle lit by sacrificial flames. Among priests of a cult, people whispered about more than they described. Between the fire and the dying man, crouched a barrel-shouldered figure in ragged trousers, back to the window, head sunk between massive shoulders. When the victim, Richard Ballville, without question lifted his head and his eyes blazed a silent plea, McGrath didn't hesitate. He vaulted the sill. The torturer sprang with surprising speed, knife flashing. McGrath's curved Afghan dagger flashed back. Steel kissed flesh. Using the silent sidewise throat stroke he had learned among mountain fighters beyond the Khyber, he cut deep. The big man dropped without a cry. McGrath had the ropes off Ballville in moments and eased him onto a battered divan. The wounded man's body trembled like overtight strings. He was delirious with pain, but lucid enough to speak. He got liquor down, and the words came. He confessed it all in a hoarse, urgent rush. 3 years earlier, Constance had not drowned. That had been his ruse. He had kidnapped her, brought her here, and held her, trying to force a marriage. He swore he had not harmed her beyond captivity. He wanted her as a wife, nothing else. And he had been too weak to use the whip. She hated him and would never break. Then he made his ruinous mistake. He invited an old acquaintance, John De Albor, whom he had once met in Vienna, an East African of mixed blood, smooth and educated outside, something else inside. De Albor saw Constance and wanted her. He began to pull the local black population descendants of Ballville slaves into his orbit, with rites from a cult older and darker than voodoo. Richard, once absolute master here, found himself suddenly powerless. When he realized the danger, he tried to flee with Constance and Ahmed, but De Albor had already turned the people. The loyal messenger who carried Ballville's telegram to town was captured. De Albor brought back his head. Before the final clash, Richard hid Constance in a place only he and McGrath knew from their boyhood, a cave on an island inside a swamp. He had sealed its mouth with iron years ago and murdered the craftsman who installed the door. There was no key. You found 3 tiny knobs on the edge of the door in a triangle, pressed each in counterclockwise circles 3 times, then pulled the central bar. "If they are going to take you and her," he rasped, "shoot her rather than let De Albor get her." Then the iron will that had held his shredded flesh together snapped, and Richard Ballville died. A man appeared at the doorway, a tall figure in a turban, silk coat, bright sash, and Turkish slippers. He introduced himself in excellent Arabic as Ali ibn Suleiman, Ahmed's brother, newly arrived from New Orleans. He had seen black men dragging Ahmed's corpse toward the river and had come seeking Ahmed's master. McGrath, knowing the fierce family loyalty of Arabs, accepted his offer to help. They left the manor behind. A faint drumbeat drifted through the trees like a heartbeat carried by wind. The path twisted down into swamp, cypress, reeking pools, clouds of mosquitoes. The trail ended at a slick of scum and shadow. "We don't swim this," McGrath said. "This place eats men." He led Ali to an old blaze mark he himself had carved on a cypress long ago. Beneath the tannin-dark water was a hidden causeway of stones, ancient, improbable engineering by forgotten hands. A submerged road to a domed hill the locals called Lost Island. They took careful strides from stone to stone, guided by barely visible marks on trees. McGrath wondered, as he had in boyhood, why the original builders had worked so hard to reach this tiny island refuge. Ritual, both perhaps. The island rose like a granite knuckle out of the swamp, encircled by thick growth. On its face, half hidden by vines, a symbol McGrath remembered had been chiseled long ago. He tore the vines aside to reveal the iron door. His fingers found the 3 hidden knobs, pressed them in the right turnings. The bar gave under his pull. The door swung inward on oiled hinges, revealing a clean-lit tunnel with a grated door at its far end to keep out snakes and insects. Beyond the grill was a simple furnished room carved from rock and lit from above. Food tins, water, a hammock, carpets, and a woman asleep on her arm, hair a spill of gold in a sunbeam. McGrath's call brought Constance to her feet. For a blissful moment the world narrowed to the circle of their embrace. Then common sense returned. They needed to move now. He called to Ali to come in, to help gather supplies for hiding in the swamps. Constance's warning came a heartbeat too late. A jolt hammered the base of his skull. The drugged brandy Ali had pressed on him back on the island, some Zimbabwe poison that stayed inert until triggered by a blow welled up and paralyzed him. He fell like a cut puppet, eyes open, mind howling. Ali tore off turban and glasses. His true features showed in the light, the murky whites of his eyes betraying the mixed heritage his clothes had concealed. His voice, so sonorous in Arabic, dropped to rough gutturals. He laughed at Constance's pleas. McGrath's rage burned impotently. He couldn't move a finger. They fled the tunnel. Moments later, Constance screamed again. This time, deeper voices answered many of them. Through the foliage, McGrath glimpsed hulking figures dragging Constance away, De Albor following, gesturing angrily as the group splashed into the marsh. Time dissolved. Insects swarmed through the open door. That, too, was deliberate. They expected him never to rise again. But McGrath's constitution, forged by hard years and close calls, fought. Words returned to his lips first, then fingers twitched, then arms, then legs. He staggered out into late afternoon and found the rock road again. He tracked them along the main path by the marks they left. Splayed bare toes, the print of a slippered foot, the faint touch of a woman's shoe. Where the ground hardened, a shred of Constance's dress clung to bark at a turn they took. The trail veered south. Vines were bent along a side path. He moved faster, revolver ready and fury cold. He found a cabin by the junction of 2 paths. A big black man, hidden behind a trunk, watched the cabin door, waiting. De Albor appeared in the doorway, scanned the trail, and went back inside. The watcher lifted his fingers to whistle. then dropped them again. McGrath slipped up and knocked the watcher out with a blow to the skull, then charged the rear door. It splintered under his shoulder. Inside was only De Albor. McGrath dropped the pistol. No bullet would balance his ledger. He hit De Albor like a falling tree. They smashed the cot to sticks, rolled on the dirt floor. McGrath's hands locked on the priest's throat with a single purpose: to kill. He was very close to doing it when a sliver of reason cut through his blood haze. He eased his grip enough for speech. Where was Constance? De Albor gagged and gasped. The worshippers had seized her for sacrifice as the full moon rose the moon of Zimbabwe. They were beyond his control. He claimed he had tried to save her, but the crowd, drunk on ritual, had locked him in the cabin and set a guard to hold him until it was over. He begged for his life, swearing that only he could delay the rite. Let him appear suddenly before them and assert supernatural escape. His prestige would return. He could postpone the sacrifice until near dawn and steal her away. They could flee together. Then the two men could fight for her if they wished. McGrath didn't trust a syllable. But Constance would be dead by midnight if nothing changed. He agreed, with conditions. He would follow and hide at the clearing's edge, revolver aimed at De Albor's back. They dragged the stunned guard inside and tied him. Twilight thickened as they skirted the main trail and moved on footpaths through the forest. Close to the site, De Albor stopped and gestured McGrath forward as if to whisper. McGrath leaned in, and the stone De Albor had palmed cracked against his temple. The priest bolted into the gloom. When McGrath came around, the moon was near rising. The woods were black as a cave. He still had his gun, and Knife De Albor hadn't dared linger to strip him. McGrath pushed on toward a faint brightness ahead. The clearing opened like a bowl of shadow rimmed with trees. The full moon hung low, staining the light red at first. Hundreds of figures crouched in a huge semicircle, utterly silent, faces turned to the center. There were no drums, no songs, none of the voodoo trappings McGrath had seen in Caribbean rites. Zimbabwe was older. Silence was his mantle. At the exact center stood an iron-bound post and a chain, and the thing chained there made McGrath's stomach turn. Traders had told stories in Africa of carnivorous apes, the sacred beasts of the Zimbabwe. He had dismissed them as campfire nonsense. Not now. This creature's shaggy grey coat flashed silver in moonlight. Its limbs were thick as beams. Long, hooked talons curved from its fingers. Its face was gorilla-like, but its mouth opened cat-like, revealing saber fangs made for rending flesh. This was a Zemba, a surviving obscenity from an age before man remembered, a warped echo of life's ancient experiments. A procession stepped from the trees, young men and women, naked except for feathered capes and monkey skin mantles props De Albor had evidently supplied. 3 times they knelt and touched their heads to the ground before the chained beast. Then they formed 2 facing lines and began to move, not dancing with their feet as much as writhing with shoulders, hips and spines, a dry, sinuous choreography as old as fear. No one spoke. The Zemba did, though. It screamed, a high, metallic tearing sound McGrath had heard once before years ago on the edges of the Forbidden Country, a sound the tribesmen had called the god's voice. The dancers scattered like leaves, and a new pair entered the light. John De Albor stalked in first, naked except for a feathered mantle and a circlet of gold, a wand in his hand like a priest-king out of a drowned empire. Behind him came Constance, drugged, glassy-eyed, naked, led by a cord around her neck. De Albor's skin gleamed pale and slick with sweat. Fear and determination fought in his face. He had failed to sway the crowd. Now, his only way to survive was to kill the offering himself. The monstrous ape surged on its chain, froth puffing from its lips. The iron post shuddered. The seated worshippers hissed softly, bodies swaying. Constance stumbled, half pushed toward the stake. McGrath didn't think. He acted. His 44 roared. The Zemba shrieked as the bullet bit its skull. For a frozen instant, nothing moved. Then the ape gathered the chain in its hands and wrenched. The links parted with a dry crack. De Albor stood directly before it, transfixed. The beast hit him like a landslide. Claws opened him. Fangs crushed his skull. He died in a single blur of motion. Then the Zemba turned on the crowd. Panic exploded. People trampled one another in a blind stampede. The beast ripped through them, smashing and tearing, a roaring embodiment of blind, ancient savagery. McGrath sprinted into the clearing, oblivious to the chaos, straight for Constance, who lay stunned where she had fallen. He scooped her up. Recognition slowly cleared her eyes. Horror followed it. The Zemba's shadow fell over them. McGrath put Constance behind him and fired point blank into the monster's chest, round after round. It came on anyway, rage animating ruined muscle. The last cartridge clicked empty. He hurled the gun at its face and met its lunge with cold steel, driving his dagger up beneath its ribs. At the same instant, something in the beast gave way. The storm of bullets had done their work. The ape swayed, then fell with the massive finality of a toppled statue. The clearing was a litter of bodies, broken and still. The survivors crashed away through the trees, their silence finally broken by the raw sounds of terror. De Albor lay in a gnawed heap. There would be no more priestcraft here. The cult he'd imported had shattered itself on its own horror. Constance clung to McGrath, shaking, sobbing. He held her and murmured words he barely heard himself say. Richard was dead in his house, Ahmed in the road, De Albor in the glade. The worshippers scattered, the god broken. The moon of Zimbabwe had burned out above the pines. The old nightmare across an ocean and across time had flared and gone dark. There was nothing left to prevent them leaving this haunted country. For McGrath and Constance, it would be dawn next clean air, a river, a road out. The long black chapter had closed, and somewhere beyond the trees, the first edge of morning would find them together again, alive.